Hello there, Evie here, and welcome to my review of the MSI Forge 100R. First off, what a name. It sounds good and it's easy to remember, unlike lots of other cases. Anyway, before we really get into the meat of the review, I've laid out a few timestamps in the video description to help you get where you want to go, so without further ado, let's get into this. Starting with a little unboxing, it's all very standard, all perfectly fine. One thing I will say is a general tip for avoiding the static shock when first touching a case after unboxing it, like this: grip a large metal object like a screwdriver with your whole hand and touch it against the case. It spreads out that zap you get across the whole of your hand and isn't nearly as shocking. So anyway, back to the case. Right off the bat, it's clearly got a distinct style. We've got an interesting split mesh panel up front with plenty of angles to catch the light and emphasize depth. This panel is strongly linked to the two 120mm 4-pin fans placed either side of the front split, and depending on the version of the case you get, these will be ARGB with the 100R like we have here, or RGB with the 100M with a cost saving which we'll discuss more later. There is also a 101M which is RGB with a third RGB fan to the rear as well. Anyway, the fancy side of the case has a mildly tinted tempered glass panel with 4 slightly odd screws. The screws themselves are fine, but the grommets are friction attached to the screw, which kind of adds some, well, friction I guess when replacing them. Not a deal breaker by any stretch, and it's honestly one of the biggest problems I have with the case, which should give you a good idea of just how good it is. Below the glass is a subjectively appealing graphic. Now I think it takes away from the overall look of the case, and it doesn't do a good job of matching the front panel, which is driving the theme after all. Opposing the glass panel is a solid steel panel, which incorporates one of the best retention mechanisms of any case. We've got this linear hook all the way down the front, as most cases do, but the holes and hooks to the top and base have been completely aborted, leaving us with essentially a hinge to the front and some screws to the rear. I'll call forwards towards the end of the video when replacing the side panel, or actually taking it off. You can see the panel pop off because of the pressure of the cables behind it. The hinge style means replacing the panel with a pile of cables behind is just child's play. Up top we've got our front I/O comprising of an LED switch, a couple of USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A ports, separate mic and headphone jacks, and finally reset and power buttons. And just behind we've got a simple magnetically applied filter sheet to reduce the dust settling in your system. Down to the base, the front section is dedicated to offering a couple of placement options for the drive cage, which we'll elaborate more on when we get inside. And the rear holds up the cheapest possible filter sheet for the power supply unit intake, my second minor gripe. While we're down here, a bigger issue I found was with the feet. While the feet themselves are well sized for power supply fan side down intake, the pads on the feet are positioned in these formed grooves. It's a nice touch to keep the pads consistently in the right position during installation in the factory, but the foam is quite compressible with a full system installed, which means you'll end up sliding the system around on the plastic ridges surrounding the foam pads, which, well, creates scraping on the desk. Now, I did find in several reviews, and it was brought to my attention by somebody in my Discord, that these are rubber in some people's reviews, which I have no idea what the issue is with there. I've contacted MSI, had no response on it, so as far as I'm concerned, these are foam, and they may have been rubber in some reviews, in some of the review samples and units. Anyway, finishing off the exterior overview, we have the rear. Everything is very standard, but a couple of areas I think are worthy of highlighting are the rear PCI Express slot covers that are all snap-off ones. A little disappointing, but they do include 2 replacement covers in the parts bag, which should be enough for most people's needs when it comes to, say, selling the case down the line. And up top, we've got a large solid section of steel advertising the 240mm top radiator support, but keep it down to a 30mm thick radiator plus the fans on top of that, or you'll probably run into some trouble. And while we're here, you could throw a couple of 140mm fans up top if you really wanted. Back round to the front, you can squeeze another 240mm radiator with fans up to 65mm in total depth, or 3 120mm or 2 140mm fans with a total width of around 140-ish millimeters. And holding up the rear, you could squeeze a 120mm radiator and fan in if you're so inclined. But if you really hate money, why not throw in a couple of 120mm fans in the base of the case? Yes, there are screw holes for it, but there's no mention of why or how you would use them in the manual. Now, I'm sure you could find a benefit of doing so, but it's an awkward fit, and it probably won't be the best bang for buck way of knocking a few degrees off your GPU. A closer look at the manual for a second is actually pretty decent at presenting how the case should work and where everything should go. Even the lighting diagram is well laid out to show how you should wire it for motherboard or case control. There's even a weird hybrid thing going on with that. But flip the manual over and we've traveled back in time. No, seriously, the case on these diagrams aren't even of the case we're looking at, and nearly half of the diagrams are conflicting with the better diagram on the front side. A bit of a rush job if you ask me. So now we're past the overview, let's get on to the build side of the review. Starting with the 3.5-inch drive cage, there are a couple of position options. Option 1 is towards the front, which gives you a meager 27-ish millimeters of space for pretty much just an internally installed fan. The fans are by stock on this case are externally installed, but it gives you a good 205 millimeters of space to the rear for your power supply unit and cables. Option 2 is pushing the cage to the rear, which provides a more comfortable 55-ish millimeters for a radiator and fan in the front, and up to 175 millimeters of space for a power supply unit and the power cables to the rear. The drive sleds themselves are a little disappointing. The first count of disappointment is the semi-melted state to the face of one of them. Functionally, it doesn't detract from the sled, so it's not a big deal, but it's not great to see. But more importantly, the design of the drive cage requires you to flex it to squeeze a 3.5-inch drive in place. I much prefer the 3-piece drive sled or even the winged drive sled designs. It's much better, it offers you a much cleaner and less sketchy approach to installations. The design on this one just feels very weak, very cheap. Now, onto the power supply unit. If you take a closer look into the basement, you'll notice that the chassis within the power supply unit area has a cutout, which will normally be for seeing through to it from the outside, but there's a basement cover which makes this a bit of a head scratcher. But if you take a look at the MSI website, you'll notice there's a Vampiric 100 lineup of cases that looks a little familiar, somewhat related to this one, you might say. That's not actually a bad thing by any means. The internal chassis layout of this is actually really solid, so if you like the look of the front panel on that one, maybe have a look around for that. Anyway, the power supply unit installation itself was pretty straightforward, minus the drive cage position, with the drive cage in its furthest back or furthest towards the rear position, providing 205mm of space for the power supply unit. I couldn't squeeze the 140mm Strider Gold series power supply unit from SilverStone with all the cables connected. However, once the drive cage was loosened up, the power supply unit fitted in without an issue, and the drive cage could be fitted back into the furthest back position. While we're on the topic of the cage position and power supply unit, I wouldn't go any longer than a 140mm power supply unit with the drive cage far back, and no longer than 170mm with it far forward, so keep that in mind when considering your front-end cooling options. Moving on, a habit I've got into lately, which I think is quite good, is cable managing right after the power supply unit has been installed first. Rather than getting bogged down with getting all the components in place and then cramming the cables into suit afterwards, I think as long as you know where all the cables need to go and what you're installing, you've got more room to work with to get the bulk of the cables in place. This can be especially important with some cases regarding the EPS or CPU power connector, since in many cases the cable management hole for it will get covered up by the motherboard somewhat, but since this case has decent radiator support up top, it avoids that issue entirely. On the topic of cable management, generally I have to say I'm impressed with not only the amount and locations of most of the cable management loops, but they're also well sized for 10mm wide Velcro straps, which on a tangent I think is the best solution for cable management, and they're also oriented in a manner which just makes sense. I've played around with many cases, enough to know that this sort of thing gets overlooked all of the time, and it's so simple to get right. However, on a slightly negative note, perhaps, I'm on the edge of saying it could do with a few more millimeters of depth between the motherboard tray and the steel side panel, but it's not really that bad, and issues can be avoided with reasonable cable management. And I suppose the side panel retention mechanism really helps out here, so I can't knock too many points off of that. 2.5-inch drive support in this case can only be described, in my books at least, as excellent. First off, there's a very low profile 2.5-inch drive panel to the rear, which can just about squeeze a 14mm drive in, so there's potential for 4 terabytes of storage here. However, there is a fairly irritating restriction in the form of the retention screw. This prevents the power connector from the drive being plugged into the top, so you'll have to either void the screw entirely or connect from the bottom. There are also a couple of extra extra drive positions, which push the 2.5-inch drive support from meh to pretty damn excellent. They're to the side of the motherboard region and make excellent use of the extra space this case provides to increase the graphics card compatibility. It's still not as good as the Q300L's 2.5-inch drive compatibility, which you could double up the drives either side of the motherboard tray, which was really solid, not officially supported. One of the few things that case did really well, but it's pretty great nonetheless. How about the motherboard though? Compatibility goes up to ATX. I'm using micro ATX board as it forms part of my test system, and there's nothing to complain about in terms of the install, all very open and very clean. CPU cooler clearance is up to 160mm, which encapsulates the Scythe Mugen 5 well, which for testing is cooling a 6700K. And last but not least, the graphics card installation. Yes, again we've got snap-off PCI Express slot covers, and since we've got a few extras like an ARGB controller, ARGB fans, and 4-pin fans throughout, as well as 2 replacement slot covers, at this price I can kind of let it go. The graphics card install itself was fairly eventless. There's so much space inside the case there isn't any risk of clashing, and you can install up to a 330mm card with internally installed fans. However, the screw cover thingy was a bit of a pain, and the screw holes weren't threaded, so it required a fairly aggressive screw, so not that great. What you're looking at now is the stock build that will form part of the thermal and acoustic test graphs. This and all of the other test setups have the graphics card's fans spinning at 1350 RPM or 50% speed, and the CPU cooler's fans spinning at 70% around 1180 RPM. These speeds are determined by the acoustically limited testing of the Scythe Mugen 5 on the test bench. The case fans, on the other hand, will be spinning at full speed to understand this case's best stock thermal performance and worst stock acoustic performance. However, that's not the limit of the testing. We'll also be ripping out all of the stock fans, filling up the case with 5 EVGA Vardar F4 120 ERs. There'll be 3 intakes in the front, 1 exhaust up top, and 1 exhaust to the rear. With this setup, we'll be running a couple of different series of tests. One of them will limit the fan speed to match a noise level of 36.5 dBA at 40 centimeters from the case at a 45-degree angle. 36.5 dBA is about as reasonably quiet as I can measure before getting too close to the noise floor of the environment around, and this will form one of the cornerstones of comparisons to other cases, as it's a normalized characteristic that all the cases are meeting. And the second series of tests says screw acoustics and spins the fans up to full speed to see what the maximum thermal performance we can squeeze out of this case, and also the minimum acoustic performance, I guess. Anyway, let's get into some thermal testing results. Starting with the stock max testing, again the stock fans that came with the case are running at full speed, with Priority 5 pushing out roughly 90 watts on the CPU and Thermark pushing out roughly 150 watts on the GPU. We can see the Forge 100R is roughly comparable to the Masterbox MB311L, and a good 5 degrees hotter than the test system on the test bench without any case fans. This is by no means a poor performer, but it's just competing against very airflow optimized cases here. More on that in a second. To gain more context for these results, let's change over to the stats for the setup quickly. Here we can see the stock fans for the Forge 100R are topping out at just shy of 1400 RPM, and all in all they're actually reasonably quiet. Anything below 40 dBA in my book is decently quiet, 45 and up is where things start to get uncomfortable long term in my book. Reducing the total load on the system by running the Firestrike combined test on a loop for 10 minutes, the 100R trades places with the MB311L. Perhaps the extra space in the 100R isn't creating the wind tunnel effect that the smaller micro ATX cases can, and this has manifested itself in a less extreme test. Who knows? Let's delve into some further testing. How about replacing all the stock fans for the EK Vardars and acoustically limiting them? Back to Priority 5 and Thermark, with all the cases outputting the same noise level, the 100R is extremely competitive. All the stats outside of the test bench are within half a degree of one another. And here's what I mean by all of them being well optimized for airflow. To get down to the target noise level of 36.5 dBA at 40 centimeters, all the case fans in all of these cases are spinning at 30% or less. In the case of the 100R, I had to push down to riding the stall line of 27% on the fan speed just to make the acoustic target. All of these cases have a lot of mesh up front, which lets out a lot of noise from the front, but also provides very little airflow resistance. So how about Firestrike with the acoustically limited testing? Well, in this instance, it would appear the 3 fans up front in the 100R created a wall of airflow which extinguished the poor, lesser performance with the GPU we saw earlier in the stock testing with Firestrike. However, the CPU doesn't seem to be faring quite as well, but very close to the others nonetheless. How about we really push things up and see how far this goes? Spinning the fans up to full speed drives the 100R towards the front of the pack ahead of the test bench, but not quite good enough to get close to the Signum. It was very close to the Signum in noise output, however, pushing over 50 dBA. That's noise cancelling headphone long-term territory. And in Firestrike, it's a similar story, but the test bench got the better of the 100R this time. The thing about the full speed testing here is it doesn't really hold a lot of water in reality. I mean, only for, say, a long render where you're not in the room with it, I'd say it would make sense. There's not a great deal of thermal performance increase compared to the acoustic performance decrease, but it's fun to know what difference it does make. So to clarify, the Forge 100R reduced thermals from the acoustic testing by 4 degrees on the GPU and 6 degrees on the CPU for an additional 15 dBA of noise. I'd say stick to reasonable fan speeds. So the big question is, how does the performance factor into the price of the case? Well, for a start, the 100R costs around £60 or €65, roughly the same price as the Signum and the MB311L, only the 100R is an ATX case. I haven't got a dollar figure for this because I don't think they sell this thing in America and possibly Canada as well, unfortunately. And it's a big shame, actually. If we take this price and mash it with some performance data, specifically the performance data from the acoustically normalized Firestrike test, it's not a shock to see that it's extremely competitive with the other cases in both CPU and GPU performance. Not the test bench though, that thing costs over £100 for the case. To make this a little more digestible, I'll flag up the GPU and CPU price versus performance graphs individually, so pause if you want to check these out for longer. So let's wrap this video up. The internal design of the case, as far as I'm concerned, is solid. There's not a lot of space that's wasted, the cable management support has been well thought out, and there's great support for components generally. The performance out of the box is good, and there's not a lot more you can push out of the case by adding a ridiculous amount of fans running at ridiculous speeds, such as the EK Vardar fans I added in. They were running at 2000 RPM. That was on the graphs, I just didn't say it out loud. The stock fans themselves are reasonably quiet at full speed, and slowing them down to more reasonable everyday speeds makes this a pleasantly quiet case. All made better by the fact that all the fans on this are 4-pin PWM fans, not something that's present in either of the cases I was comparing it to. And lastly, the build quality is good. We're not working with the highest quality materials and finishes, the thicker steel, but nor are we paying for price for such things. For £60 for 65-ish euros, it's a design that's very usable and compatible, with a finish and build quality that's average, but with little bonuses like the fans and lighting. So I can confidently say I would definitely consider this one. So there we have it. Thank you so much for checking this one out. If you were considering picking this one up, please consider using the Amazon associate links in the video description. It will give a small kickback to the channel, which is useful for running the channel. Otherwise, if you want to check out more videos, please look over there, like and subscribe over there. And if you want to help me push the channel forward, please consider supporting me on Patreon. That's all I've got. Thanks so much for checking this review out, and I will catch you next time. A small bonus for those of you who made it to the end, this CPU cooler was specifically there. I did sit on it as well. I think I mentioned that somewhere else. But anyway, it was only hiding the really dodgy connection I've had to form because my VideoMic Pro, it turns out, for the whole time I've had it, has had a dodgy connection. And I thought it was my camera when it was plugged into the camera. So there we go. Anyway, that was there to cover that. Thanks for checking this one out. Catch you next time.